The black sedan rolled to a slow stop at the rusted iron gate, its engine humming softly as if reluctant to disturb the quiet of the street. Daniel Hartman remained inside for a moment longer than necessary, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the familiar curve of the fence. The gate leaned slightly to one side, exactly as it had when he was 16 and stormed out after yet another argument, convinced the world owed him more than this place ever could. Back then, the rust had been brighter, the metal less tired. Now it looked like an old man holding himself upright through stubborn will alone. Daniel stepped out of the car, the expensive leather of his shoes sinking slightly into the uneven ground. The air carried the scent of damp soil and something faintly metallic, perhaps from the nearby rail tracks that had always rattled the windows at night. He adjusted his coat automatically, a habit formed in glass towers and chauffeured entrances, and immediately felt foolish. The house before him did not care about tailored fabric or silent watches that cost more than this entire street. He hadn't planned to return today. The visit was meant for next month, penciled in neatly between a conference in Zurich and a charity gala in New York. But the meeting that morning had ended abruptly, the deal postponed, and suddenly there was nothing pressing him forward. The empty space in his schedule had felt unsettling. Almost without thinking, he had told his driver the address. Saying it out loud had stirred something he thought long buried. The house stood at the end of the narrow lot, smaller than he remembered, its once white paint cracked and peeling in long, tired strips. The porch sagged in the middle, and one of the steps bore a dark stain where rainwater always collected. Daniel's eyes moved instinctively to the maple tree in the yard. It was still there, but thinner, its branches less confident against the sky. As a boy, he had climbed it to escape shouting, to dream of places far beyond this street. Now it looked as though it had waited for him, season after season, without complaint. He walked toward the door, each step stirring memories he had never properly sorted. The sound of his own footsteps felt intrusive. He expected the house to be silent, abandoned to dust and echoes, a place that existed only because he sent regular transfers to keep it standing. That had been his arrangement with himself, money instead of presents, checks instead of phone calls that always seemed to come at inconvenient times. His hand touched the doorknob, cool and slightly sticky with age. He pushed gently, and the door opened with a familiar, aching creak that went straight through him. He paused, bracing himself for the stale smell of neglect. Instead, warmth met him. The air carried the scent of onions, bay leaf, and something savory simmering patiently, as if the house itself were breathing again. Voices drifted from deeper inside, low and careful. Daniel's first instinct was confusion. No one should have been here. His second instinct was to retreat, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his own past. He stepped inside anyway, closing the door softly behind him. The hallway looked narrower than memory allowed. The wallpaper, once patterned with small blue flowers, was faded and peeling at the corners. A framed photograph hung crookedly on the wall, himself and Michael as boys, arms slung around each other, grinning with the careless confidence of youth. Daniel hadn't seen that picture in years. He didn't remember approving its placement or even knowing it still existed. The voices grew clearer as he moved toward the kitchen. One was unmistakably Michael's, deeper now, slower, but carrying the same steady calm that had always annoyed Daniel when they were young. The other was softer, frail, threading its way through the air like something precious and breakable. Daniel stopped at the kitchen doorway. Michael sat at the small wooden table, his back slightly hunched, his movements deliberate. The years had etched themselves into his brother's face in fine lines and shadows, but there was something grounded about him, a quiet strength Daniel had never cultivated. In his hand was a spoon, and he lifted it carefully toward their mother's mouth. She sat wrapped in a worn cardigan, her shoulders narrow, her hair thin and silver, gathered loosely at the nape of her neck. Slowly, Michael murmured, his voice gentle. "It's still hot." She smiled at him, a smile Daniel recognized instantly, one that used to soften even the hardest days. Her hands trembled slightly as she steadied the bowl, and when she laughed, it was a soft, breathy sound that tightened something in Daniel's chest. The kitchen was modest but alive. A pot bubbled quietly on the stove. A dish towel hung over the oven handle. The window above the sink was cracked open just enough to let the evening air in. Nothing here spoke of wealth, but nothing spoke of abandonment either. It was a room being used, cared for, lived in. Daniel felt rooted to the spot. His first instinct was shame, sharp and sudden. He had imagined this house empty except for occasional caretakers, imagined his money filling the gaps his absence left behind. Watching Michael lean forward to wipe a drop of soup from their mother's chin with practiced tenderness shattered that illusion completely. Their mother spoke again, her voice thin but warm. You always were patient, she said, her eyes crinkling as she looked at Michael. Not like your brother. He was always in such a hurry. The words landed harder than any accusation. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. He remembered that hurry, how it had driven him forward, away from this table, away from nights just like this. He had told himself he was building something for all of them. Somewhere along the way, the building never seemed finished enough to return. Michael chuckled softly. He gets that from Dad, he replied. Always chasing the next thing. Daniel's gaze moved over his mother's face, memorizing it as if afraid it might vanish if he didn't. The lines around her eyes were deeper, her skin more translucent. This was not the woman who used to stand at the sink humming while washing dishes, or who stayed up late sewing patches onto his school jacket. This was time made visible, time he had not witnessed. A heaviness settled in his chest, thick and unyielding. All the boardrooms, the applause, the headlines suddenly felt distant and irrelevant. Here, in this small kitchen, his success had no language. It couldn't speak to the quiet devotion in his brother's movements or the fragile joy in his mother's smile. Daniel shifted his weight, the floorboard beneath his foot letting out a small, traitorous creak. The sound was enough to make his heart jolt, but he didn't step back. He stood there, suspended between who he had been and what he was seeing now, knowing with a sudden, aching clarity that no amount of money could bridge the distance he himself had created. The creak of the floorboard seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. Michael's hand froze midair, the spoon hovering just short of their mother's lips. He turned slowly, his brows knitting together in confusion before his eyes widened. For a brief second, disbelief washed over his face, as if his mind refused to accept what it was seeing. Then his gaze dropped to Daniel's tailored coat, his polished shoes standing on the worn linoleum, and something unspoken passed between them, surprise tangled with old, unresolved distance. Their mother followed Michael's gaze. She squinted slightly, leaning forward as if the figure in the doorway might dissolve if she didn't focus hard enough. Her lips parted. Danny, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The name trembled in the air, fragile and hopeful. Daniel stepped fully into the room, the doorframe no longer able to hide him. It's me, Mom, he said, and was startled by how unsteady his voice sounded. He had delivered speeches to rooms filled with powerful people without a flicker of doubt, yet this simple sentence felt heavier than all of them combined. The spoon clinked softly against the bowl as Michael set it down. He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. You weren't supposed to be here until next month, he said, not accusing, just stunned. I know, Daniel replied. I finished early. Thought I'd surprise you. The words sounded thin, inadequate, but they were all he had in that moment. Their mother's hands trembled more visibly now as she pushed herself up in her chair, only to be gently guided back by Michael. Careful, he murmured. She ignored him, her gaze fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Tears gathered in her eyes, spilling over and tracing slow paths down her cheeks. Daniel crossed the kitchen in a few long strides and knelt in front of her, the expensive fabric of his coat bunching awkwardly beneath him. He took her hands in his, startled by how light they felt, how the bones seemed more prominent than flesh. Her skin was warm, real, undeniable. I'm here, he said again, as if repeating it might make it more true. She reached up with one trembling hand and touched his cheek, her fingers lingering as though she were memorizing the shape of his face. You look so tired, she said softly. Have you been working too hard again? The question pierced him. Not where have you been, or why didn't you come, but concern, unchanged, unconditional. Daniel nodded, unable to trust his voice. He pressed his forehead briefly against her hand, his composure finally cracking. Tears he hadn't known were waiting slipped free, blurring his vision. Michael turned away discreetly, giving them a moment, though his own eyes shone. After a few seconds, he cleared his throat and pulled out a chair, setting it beside their mother. Sit, he said quietly to Daniel. You can talk later. Daniel obeyed, sitting close, reluctant to let go of her hand. The kitchen seemed smaller with all three of them in it, yet fuller than it had been in years. Outside, a car passed, its sound fading quickly, leaving behind a deep, comfortable stillness. I didn't know you were, Daniel began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question he was afraid of hearing answered. I'm still here, their mother said, offering a faint smile. That's enough for now. Michael returned to the stove, turning down the heat and stirring the pot. She's been stubborn, he said lightly. Doctors, schedules, pills. You know how she is. Daniel nodded, guilt pressing down on him with renewed force. You've been taking care of all this alone. Michael shrugged. Not alone. We manage. He didn't say more, but the unspoken words filled the room. We manage because someone has to. Dinner passed slowly, marked by small conversations and long silences that felt less awkward than Daniel expected. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing details of routines and appointments, of neighbors who checked in, of nights Michael slept on the couch to be closer in case their mother needed help. Each detail added another layer to the realization settling over him. Life here had continued, full and demanding, without him. Later, as the dishes soaked in the sink, Daniel stood at the window, staring out at the yard bathed in moonlight. The maple tree cast a long shadow across the grass. He remembered promising himself he would never come back, that this place represented everything he needed to escape. Now, standing here, he understood how narrow that view had been. Michael joined him, leaning against the counter. You staying long? He asked, his tone cautious, as if afraid of the answer. I don't know, Daniel admitted. Longer than I planned. He glanced at his brother. You should have told me. About Mom. About everything. Michael met his gaze evenly. You were busy, he said simply. I didn't want to be another obligation. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were fair. Daniel nodded slowly. I should have been here. Yes, Michael said, after a pause. You should have. There was no anger in it, just truth. That night, Daniel slept in his old room. The bed was narrower, the ceiling lower than he remembered, but sleep came quickly, heavily. He dreamed of childhood laughter and arguments, of doors slamming and then opening again. When he woke at dawn, light spilled through the curtains in the same pale stripes it always had. In the quiet of the early morning, he sat on the edge of the bed and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. He would rearrange his life, not abandon it, but bend it, reshape it around what mattered here. Money could fix roofs and pay for care, but it could not replace presence. He had learned that too late once. He would not make the same mistake again. When he stepped into the kitchen, his mother was already awake, sipping tea, Michael beside her. They looked up together, and in that moment, Daniel felt something settle into place. He had returned early by chance, but he would stay by choice. This time, he intended to truly come home.